The neuroscience of negative self-talk. How your words rewire your brain. Your brain is constantly listening to the words you speak, processing every complaint, every negative statement, every pessimistic prediction about your life. And here's what most people don't realize. Your brain doesn't distinguish between observing reality and creating it when you speak. Every time you complain, you're not just describing problems. You're training your mind to actively search for more problems to validate your narrative. Welcome back to Psychology with Sergiu Popovici, where we explore the science behind human behavior and what it means for your life. Today, we're diving into something that affects every aspect of your mental health. The neuroscience of how your words literally reshape your brain and construct your experience of reality. By the end of this video, you'll understand why resisting the urge to speak negatively isn't just positive thinking, it's neuroscience. Let's start with a fundamental principle for neuroscience. What you repeat, you strengthen, and what you strengthen becomes your default pattern. Research by neuroscientist Donald Hebb established what's now called Hebb's Law. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Every time you verbalize a complaint or negative thought, you're activating specific neural pathways that connect language, emotion, and perception. The more frequently you activate these pathways through repetitive negative speech, the stronger and more automatic they become. A study published in Nature Neuroscience used brain imaging to show that people who engage in frequent negative self-talk develop measurably stronger connections in brain regions associated with threat detection and negative emotion processing. Their brains literally become structurally optimized for finding and focusing on problems. This isn't metaphorical. It's physical changes in neural architecture caused by repetitive thought and speech patterns. Now let's talk about something called the reticular activating system, or RAS, which is your brain's attention filter. Your RAS determines what information gets through to your conscious awareness from the millions of stimuli your brain processes every second. Here's the critical insight. Your RAS is heavily influenced by the language you use and the beliefs you reinforce through repetitive speech. When you repeatedly say, "My life is terrible, nothing ever works out," or "I always fail," you're programming your RAS to prioritize information that confirms these statements. Psychologist Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness demonstrates this mechanism clearly. In his studies, subjects who were repeatedly exposed to negative outcomes while using negative self-descriptive language developed what he called explanatory styles that filtered reality to confirm their negative expectations. Their brains began automatically highlighting failures and dismissing successes, creating a self-fulfilling cycle of negativity. The language they used didn't just describe their experience. It actively shaped what they noticed and how they interpreted events. Research in Cognitive Linguistics by George Lakoff shows that language doesn't just reflect our thinking, it fundamentally structures how we conceptualize reality. The specific words you choose create what linguists call frames, mental structures that determine how you interpret information and what meanings you assign to experiences. When you frame your life through complaint and negative description, you're not being realistic or honest. You're choosing one possible interpretation and training your brain to see everything through that lens. A fascinating study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology tracked participants' self-talk patterns and life outcomes over 5 years. Those who engaged in high-frequency negative self-talk showed significantly worse outcomes in relationships, career satisfaction, and mental health, not because their circumstances were worse, but because their perception and responses were shaped by their habitual language patterns. They literally lived different realities based on the words they repeatedly used to describe their lives. Now here's where this gets really powerful. Research on neuroplasticity shows that changing your speech patterns can actually restructure your brain. Neuroscientist Richard Davidson's work on meditation and positive psychology interventions demonstrates that consistent practice of reframing negative thoughts and speech creates measurable changes in brain structure. Participants who spent 8 weeks practicing positive reframing showed increased gray matter density in regions associated with emotional regulation and decreased activity in the amygdala during stress. The brain is not fixed. It responds to the patterns you practice, including the patterns of your speech. Let's address something crucial that appears in the images you showed me. The difference between acknowledging pain and building your identity around it. The quote, "This doesn't mean ignore pain. It means don't build your identity around it," captures an essential psychological distinction. Research by psychologist Kristen Neff on self-compassion shows that healthy emotional processing involves acknowledging difficult feelings without making them the center of your self-concept. There's a massive difference between saying, "I'm experiencing sadness right now," and "I'm a depressed person." The first acknowledges a temporary state. The second creates an identity category that your brain then works to maintain and confirm. Studies on identity formation show that the labels you repeatedly apply to yourself become self-fulfilling through a process called identity verification. Your brain seeks consistency between your self-concept and your behavior. So if you identify as someone who always fails or a person bad things happen to, you'll unconsciously create circumstances that verify this identity. This isn't conscious self-sabotage. It's automatic identity maintenance operating below your awareness. Now let's talk about the psychology of complaint patterns specifically. Research by psychologist Guy Winch shows that habitual complaining actually makes you worse at problem solving and more likely to remain stuck in difficult situations. When you repeatedly verbalize complaints without taking action, you're training your brain that problems are permanent fixtures to be described rather than challenges to be solved. A study in applied cognitive psychology found that people who spent 15 minutes daily complaining showed decreased cognitive flexibility and problem-solving performance compared to control groups. The act of complaining was literally making them less capable of finding solutions. But here's what's particularly insidious about complaint patterns. They're socially contagious and self-reinforcing. Research on emotional contagion shows that complaint behaviors spread through social networks, creating what psychologists call co-rumination mutual reinforcement of negative thinking patterns. When you complain, others often join in, which validates your negative perspective and encourages more complaint, creating a downward spiral of negativity. Your brain interprets social validation of your complaints as evidence that your negative view is accurate and appropriate. Now let's examine the specific mechanism of how words shape perception through something called linguistic relativity. Research by cognitive scientist Lera Boroditsky demonstrates that the language you habitually use actually changes how you perceive and remember events. In her studies, people who described the same event using different linguistic frames literally remembered different details and drew different conclusions about what happened. Your words aren't just reporting reality, they're selecting which aspects of reality to encode in memory and how to interpret their meaning. When you habitually describe your life negatively, you're creating a biased archive of memories that seems to prove your life has always been negative. Here's research on what psychologists call confirmation bias, the tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information that confirms existing beliefs. Once you've established a negative narrative about your life through repetitive speech, your brain actively works to maintain that narrative by selectively attending to confirming evidence. A study in the Journal of Experimental Psychology showed that participants who verbalized negative self-beliefs spent significantly more time looking at information that confirmed those beliefs and quickly dismissed contradictory information. Their language had created a perceptual filter that maintained their negative worldview regardless of actual circumstances. Now let's talk about something that might be the most important insight. What you believe, you begin to live. This isn't mystical thinking, it's well-documented psychology. Research on self-fulfilling prophecies by psychologist Robert Rosenthal shows that expectations powerfully influence outcomes through subtle changes in behavior, attention, and interpretation. When you repeatedly tell yourself and others that your life is terrible, that you're stuck, that nothing works. You're not just describing a static reality. You're creating expectations that shape your actions. Your brain, believing these statements to be true, stops looking for opportunities, stops taking risks, stops imagining better possibilities. A longitudinal study, following people over 20 years, found that those with habitually negative self-descriptive language showed progressively narrowing life trajectories. Not because external circumstances forced this narrowing, but because their expectations and behaviors adapted to match their verbal self-descriptions. They became what they repeatedly said they were. Let me share something from cognitive behavioral therapy research that's directly relevant here. CBT, one of the most evidence-based therapeutic approaches, is fundamentally built on the principle that changing thought and speech patterns changes emotional experience and life outcomes. Decades of research show that when people learn to identify and modify negative automatic thoughts and speech patterns, they experience significant improvements in depression, anxiety, and overall life satisfaction. The mechanism is clear. Changing your words changes your neural patterns, which changes your perceptions, which changes your behaviors, which changes your outcomes. Here's research on what's called the self-distancing technique in psychological interventions. Studies show that speaking about yourself in the third person, or changing the language you use to describe difficulties, creates psychological distance that improves emotional regulation and problem solving. Simply changing "I am depressed" to "I'm experiencing depression right now," or "he's going through a difficult period," creates measurable improvements in emotional processing. The shift in language creates a shift in perspective that allows for healthier coping and clearer thinking. Now let's address the guidance to speak like someone who is growing, not someone who is stuck. This captures something important about identity-based motivation from psychology research. Studies by psychologist Katie Milkman on behavioral change show that envisioning and verbally claiming a future identity is one of the most powerful motivators for sustained behavior change. When you speak as if you're someone who is growing, learning, and progressing, even when things are difficult, you're creating what psychologists call an approach orientation rather than an avoidance orientation. Your brain focuses on moving toward desired states rather than just trying to escape current pain. Research shows approach-oriented people show greater persistence, creativity, and ultimate success in achieving goals. Here's a critical distinction from the research. Acknowledging challenges while maintaining a growth narrative is psychologically healthy and realistic. The goal isn't toxic positivity or denying difficulties. It's refusing to let temporary circumstances become permanent identity statements. Research by psychologist Carol Dweck on growth mindset demonstrates this principle clearly. People with growth mindsets experience just as many failures and difficulties as those with fixed mindsets, but they use different language to describe these experiences. Growth mindset language focuses on learning, temporary setbacks, and improvable skills, while fixed mindset language emphasizes permanent traits and unchangeable limitations. This linguistic difference predicts dramatically different outcomes in achievement, resilience, and life satisfaction. Now let's talk about practical application of this research. First, become aware of your habitual speech patterns. Research shows most people are unconscious of how frequently they engage in negative self-talk and complaint. Start noticing when you're about to complain or speak negatively about yourself or your life. Second, practice what psychologists call cognitive reframing, finding alternative ways to describe the same situation that acknowledge difficulty without creating negative identity statements. Instead of "I'm terrible at this," try "I'm still learning this skill." Instead of "My life is a disaster," try "I'm going through a challenging period right now." These aren't just semantic differences. They create fundamentally different neural and psychological responses. Third, implement what research calls benefit finding, the practice of identifying at least one learning point or growth opportunity when discussing difficulties. Studies show that people who consistently practice benefit finding show better mental health outcomes and faster recovery from adversity. Fourth, pay attention to complaint patterns in your social circles and consciously limit exposure to chronic complainers when possible. Research on emotional contagion shows that complaint behaviors are socially transmitted, and protecting your mental environment is a valid self-care strategy. And finally, be patient with yourself. Changing deeply ingrained speech patterns takes time and consistent practice. Neuroscience research shows that forming new neural pathways requires repeated activation over weeks or months before they become automatic. Every time you catch yourself and choose different words, you're strengthening new pathways and weakening old ones. Before we close, I want to emphasize something important. This isn't about suppressing genuine emotions or pretending everything is fine when it's not. Healthy emotional processing requires acknowledging and working through difficult feelings. The distinction is between processing emotions and building your identity around them, between describing temporary circumstances and creating permanent narratives. Research consistently shows that people who acknowledge challenges while maintaining growth-oriented language have better mental health than either those who deny problems or those who ruminate in negative self-description. If you find yourself stuck in negative speech patterns despite wanting to change, or if you're struggling to distinguish between healthy emotional processing and destructive rumination, professional support can help. Understanding the neuroscience of how your words shape your brain is the first step. Implementing consistent change often benefits from guided support. The research is clear. Your words are not harmless descriptions of a fixed reality. They are active agents in constructing your perception, shaping your neural pathways, and determining your life trajectory. Every time you resist the urge to complain, every time you reframe a difficulty in growth-oriented language, every time you speak as someone who is becoming rather than someone who is stuck, you're literally rewiring your brain. Change your words, change your mindset, change your life. This isn't a motivational slogan, it's neuroscience. If you're struggling with negative thought patterns, self-talk issues, or want professional guidance in developing healthier mental habits, I offer psychological consultation services in Munich, Germany. Thank you for watching Psychology with Sergiu Popovici. If this video helped you understand the power of your words, please subscribe for more research-backed insights. I'll see you in the next video.